The bell of St. Jude's had already tolled the half-hour past 11, its deep, mournful sound swallowed almost instantly by the oppressive mantle of the London fog. In the year 1888, the capital was accustomed to its nocturnal shrouds, but tonight's visitation was a thing apart. It was a fog that did not merely obscure. It seemed to press down, heavy and metallic, muffling all sound into an unnerving silence. This was the stage set for the night's terrible transaction in Harrow Alley, a narrow, unforgiving cut between high, soot-stained brick walls in the forgotten folds of old Chelsea. Miss Eliza Pennyworth stood shivering, though not solely from the damp chill seeping into her wool coat. Her nervous anticipation was a more potent cold. She clutched a heavy brass oil lantern, its single, struggling flame casting a paltry, restless circle of amber light on the greasy cobbles. The light fought a losing battle, every footfall of the fog seeming to claim a fraction of its glow. "The hour is nigh, Professor," Eliza murmured, her breath blooming briefly white before being consumed by the grey air. Professor Thresher, standing opposite her, did not shift his focus from the dark mouth of the alley. His figure, normally so imposing in his signature black bowler and severe coat, was rendered two-dimensional by the gloom. He was a silhouette of singular, dreadful purpose. His silence was absolute, a man so consumed by his life's ultimate quest, the acquisition of the Aetheric Regulator, that the petty concerns of weather, time, or safety had long ceased to exist. He had hunted this object, an artifact he believed could redraw the lines of energy and existence across 3 continents. Now, it was moments away from his grasp. Eliza glanced at the scattered instruments at her feet, a delicate, ship-worn sextant, a squat, spinning disk chronometer, and a map of the city that now seemed uselessly charted for an unearthly journey. They were his validation tools, meant to measure the unmeasurable nature of the object. They looked frail, almost ridiculous, against the monolithic silence of the buildings and the deep, abiding blackness that stretched just beyond the lantern's reach. The professor had warned her that the regulator was an object of non-terrestrial manufacture, a concept that had thrilled her scientific heart until the fog had descended and made the very air feel wrong. The profound stillness was the most terrifying element. Not the silence of a sleeping city, but the aggressive quiet of a place actively holding its breath. Even the distant, customary clatter of a hansom cab or the shouts of a late-night street vendor were absent. It was as if the alley itself had been cut loose from London, floating in a dimension defined only by the struggling light of her lantern and the professor's grim, unwavering silhouette. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. She tightened her grip on the lantern, wishing its heat could somehow reach her core. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the fog, that the entity about to emerge from the darkness was not a mere vendor, and the gilded box they carried was not merely a treasure. It was a key, and whatever lock it opened would be sprung here, tonight, in this desolate, forgotten strip of Chelsea cobble. The minutes stretched into an eternity of nervous, watchful dread, waiting for the veiled figure to materialize from the unnatural gloom. Professor Thresher was not a man known in the polite academic circles of Bloomsbury, nor was he listed in the registries of the Royal Society. His education was a patchwork of arcane knowledge, acquired from forgotten monasteries, sealed libraries in Alexandria, and the shadowed backrooms of continental antiquarians. To the few who knew of him, he was simply the collector of the unsanctioned, a man whose interest lay exclusively in the intersection of physics and the utterly improbable. He sought objects that proved the universe was not the predictable clockwork machine described by Newton, but a vast, chaotic entity susceptible to impossible intervention. His drawing room on Cheyne Walk was not filled with traditional scholarly volumes, but with objects of escalating menace. There was the Hungarian whisper box, which generated a continuous subsonic hum that induced crippling anxiety in those who heard it, the Persian mirror that showed events 12 hours into the future, a terrifying certainty that drove his last assistant to the asylum, and the iron-bound volume, still locked, said to be written in a language that existed only in dreams. These were unsettling, yet merely dangerous. The Aetheric Regulator was of a different order entirely. For the last year, Thresher's life had narrowed to a singular, consuming point, the acquisition of this gilded box. The legend, pieced together from fragments of Chaldean astrology and medieval alchemy, claimed the regulator was an object of profound, cosmic instability. It didn't consume energy, it consumed essence. It drew power not from chemical reactions or stored force, but from ambient light, heat, and, most terrifyingly, from the very vitality of living beings nearby. It was rumored to have caused a 7-day, impenetrable darkness over a small village in the Carpathians centuries ago. Thresher, however, saw not catastrophe, but control. He was certain that if he could harness and study the regulator's mechanism for drawing non-terrestrial power, he could revolutionize energy, perhaps even halt the decay of matter itself. This megalomaniacal vision was what drove him, pushing him past any moral or ethical boundary. His pursuit had cost fortunes, reputation, and now, he knew, it might cost the very breath in his lungs. He had learned of the veiled figure's existence through a feverish correspondence with a disgraced Viennese occultist. The figure was the regulator's current, mysterious custodian, seeking a staggering sum of gold and a rare, untraceable element Thresher had spent 6 months synthesizing. It was a Faustian bargain, one Thresher had accepted without hesitation. Standing in the cold, oppressive silence of Harrow Alley, his eyes fixed on the darkness from which the keeper of his desire would emerge, Professor Thresher felt a dangerous, exhilarating calm. The end of his quest was at hand, and the dark cost was a small price for such absolute, forbidden knowledge. The dangerous artifacts of the past were mere trinkets compared to the terrible majesty he was about to possess. He had to have it. He was ready. The instruments scattered on the slick cobblestones were not mere tools, they were the professor's last, desperate defense against chaos. Eliza's gaze swept over the precise arrangement, a ritual of calibration she had performed countless times in workshops and darkened fields, but which felt profoundly fragile tonight. Directly beneath the swaying lantern was an antique survey map of London, dating from 1850. It was carefully pinned at the corners with small, brass weights. The map was utterly useless for locating the current rendezvous point, its true purpose was as a baseline. Professor Thresher believed the Aetheric Regulator would warp local space, and the map, with its rigid geometry, was meant to be the first indicator of that dimensional stress. Beside the map lay the sextant, its mirror and arc gleaming dully. Typically used for celestial navigation, tonight it was inverted. Its function was to measure the angular deviation of the gas lamp hanging above, an experiment Thresher had devised to detect minute changes in the structure of the air itself, a shift he termed etheric refraction. If the artifact truly drew power from surrounding essence, it should twist the path of light, even the dim rays from the alley lamp. Nearby, a clockwork chronometer, wound with painstaking accuracy, rested on a piece of velvet. It was not intended to measure time, but to record the magnetic field readings from a series of embedded iron filings. Thresher theorized that the regulator would create an intense, localized magnetic void as it initiated its consumption of ambient energy. The chronometer's sole function was to register the exact moment the magnetic field collapsed, the instant the regulator was fully active. The sheer detail of the preparation testified to the professor's brilliance and his terrifying arrogance. He sought to quantify the supernatural, to force an alien force into the language of mathematics. But Eliza, witnessing the instruments in the sickly, fighting light of her lantern, felt only dread. They were too small, too delicate, against the raw, unquantifiable horror he was about to unleash. She had studied the schematics of the regulator, noting the 8-pointed star clasp, a symbol not of man's science, but of ancient, binding power. A new sound, softer than the fog, began to register, a faint click, click against the wet cobbles. It was the subtle displacement of stones, not footsteps, but something being dragged. Eliza realized the instruments were no longer merely waiting for the object. They were now in its proximity, and their silent vigil was about to be broken. The map, she noted with a spike of alarm, already showed a tiny, unsettling discoloration along its nearest edge, a premonition of the scorching to come. The transaction was initiating before the parties had even fully met. The source of the click against the stones resolved itself from the deep shadow just as the clock finished its half-hour chime. It was the veiled figure. It did not stride, nor did it shuffle. It simply flowed out of the alley's oppressive darkness, a vertical stripe of absolute blackness given motion. There was no visible face, no discernible gender, no hint of humanity beneath the profound, heavy fabric. The cloak was a masterwork of light absorption, seeming to draw in the meager rays of Eliza's lantern like dry linen soaking up water. Eliza gasped, stifling the sound with her teeth. Her hand, clutching the lantern, instinctively tightened. The figure was unsettlingly tall, yet strangely devoid of mass. Its gait was a silent glide, the only sound the faint metallic drag of the thing it carried, which was momentarily hidden from view. Professor Thresher, the master of control, remained utterly still. His eyes, however, seemed to sharpen in the gloom, reflecting the awful, consuming excitement of the collector who finally beholds his rarest quarry. He had dealt with shady, desperate people before, but this was different. This entity moved with a non-human certainty, a lack of haste that suggested infinite time and boundless power. The figure stopped precisely at the edge of the light's weak circle, remaining half-shrouded in the fog. Only now did Eliza see what caused the dragging sound. The gilded box itself, strapped to the figure's torso and held by two oddly elongated, gloved hands. It was the focus of the night, a gleaming point of ornate brass and gold leaf against the consuming blackness of its bearer. A strange, chemical odor, not of London smog, but of ozone and ancient spice, wafted out of the fog with the figure's arrival. This was not a person of flesh and blood dealing a mundane object. This was a transaction with the edges of reality itself. The silence between the three was enormous, weighted with the history of the object and the potential horror of its transfer. The figure was a living aperture into the realm of the non-terrestrial, and its presence instantly confirmed every wild theory Professor Thresher had ever held about the regulator. Eliza found her terror rooted in the creature's perfect stillness, its unwavering, silent command over the darkness it brought with it. The exchange was about to begin, and the atmosphere in Harrow Alley had become thick, cold, and utterly terrifying. The negotiation was a terrifying pantomime, conducted entirely without speech. The silence of the alley amplified every subtle movement, turning the exchange into a ritual of high dread. Professor Thresher had previously delivered his half of the bargain to an intermediary weeks earlier. The staggering weight of rare gold and the difficult-to-synthesize element, aurum exilium, now confirmed to be in the veiled figure's possession. Now, the transaction was reduced to a final, harrowing verification. Thresher extended his hand, not to touch the box, but to gesture with sharp, demanding authority toward the gilded casing. He was not asking for permission, he was demanding confirmation of the artifact's authenticity. His gaze was fixed on the 8-pointed star clasp, the signature mechanism of the Aetheric Regulator. He needed to ensure the seals were intact and that the terrible power within had not been tampered with. The veiled figure responded with unnerving, glacial slowness. The elongated, gloved fingers, they seemed too long to be human, carefully rotated the gilded box, presenting the star clasp to the professor's inspection. There was no defiance in the action, only a chilling, mechanical compliance, as if the figure were merely a vessel, detached from the object's power. Eliza, holding the lantern steady, could now see the details of the box. The brass was ancient, etched with symbols that looked less like writing and more like scars. A palpable, deep cold emanated from the metal, battling the warmth of her lantern flame and winning. The risk of the transaction was not just in the money and the materials. It was the profound ontological risk that the regulator represented. By touching it, by even standing near it, they were tampering with the fundamental laws of energy transfer. Thresher, in his hubris, was willing to pay that price for absolute, forbidden knowledge. He nodded once, a crisp, final agreement. The terms were met, the goods verified. He extended his arms, ready to take the artifact that had consumed his life. He was transferring the ownership of a primordial force, a decision that would either elevate him to the apex of scientific history or erase him from it entirely. The veiled figure began its slow, inevitable presentation of the box, pushing it toward the professor's expectant, trembling hands. The moment of no return had arrived. As the veiled figure slowly maneuvered the artifact into the lantern's dim reach, the gilded box was fully revealed. It was shockingly small for an object of such terrifying power, no larger than a child's toy chest, yet it possessed a disturbing gravitational presence. The box was not constructed of wood or leather, but of tightly fitted plates of ancient, tarnished brass, inlaid with fine gold leaf that seemed to absorb and re-emit the lantern light in a muted, sickly fashion. Its craftsmanship was utterly unlike anything from Victorian Europe. The brass was etched with intricate, repetitive patterns, not decorative flourishes, but precise, functional schematics that spoke of geometry far older than Euclidean mathematics. These were not symbols to be read, but channels to guide energy. The box's surface was oddly rough, almost chitinous, as if it had been grown rather than forged. The 8-pointed star clasp at its center was the most disturbing feature. Made of a dark, crystalline metal that looked utterly opaque, it was not a lock but a complex sealing mechanism. Thresher had identified it as an octagram of stasis, a design theorized to bind and contain energies that defy terrestrial physics. It was this clasp that assured him the item was genuine. The object was not merely a container. It was a sophisticated device whose function was to regulate the terrible forces within. 2 thick straps of heavy, oil-darkened leather secured the box, wrapping around it several times. These looked more earthly, added later by some desperate custodian to manage its handling. Despite the light-absorbing fabric of the veiled figure, the box itself seemed to demand the surrounding light, drinking it in, causing the gold inlays to momentarily flash with cold intensity. Eliza could sense the air around the artifact vibrating slightly, a high-frequency tension that hurt her teeth. The regulator was not just a myth. It was a dense, cold pocket of impossibility, now resting mere inches from Professor Thresher's reaching hands. The moment of physical transfer was imminent, and the weight of the universe seemed to compress into that small, beautiful, and profoundly deadly object. The moment of physical transfer was executed with chilling, surgical precision. The veiled figure extended its unnatural, gloved hands, carefully resting the gilded box atop Professor Thresher's waiting, gloved palms. Thresher made a minute, audible sound, a sharp intake of breath, a noise of ultimate satisfaction. But before the professor could fully secure his prize, the alley was plunged into an impossible, immediate gloom. The artifact did not merely darken the surroundings, it actively stole the light. Eliza Pennyworth felt a sudden, visceral cold that was distinct from the London damp. It was the sensation of absence. Her oil lantern, the sole, brave source of illumination, did not flicker, nor did its flame extinguish in a puff of smoke. Instead, its radiant power was sucked inward. Eliza stared, horrified, as the bright, amber heart of the flame collapsed upon itself. The golden light seemed to drain out of the glass, pulled toward the gilded box with a terrifying, instantaneous velocity. The intricate brass etchings on the box's surface seemed to momentarily glow with a negative luminance, a cold, hungry light that consumed its source. The glow lasted perhaps half a second, but in that moment, Eliza understood the horrifying truth of the Aetheric Regulator. It was not a device for storing energy, it was a mechanism for devouring existence. The flame in the lantern did not die. It became a pathetic, weak blue point, a miserable ember fighting to retain its identity. The surrounding area, now stripped of its essential light, seemed to have taken on a profound, terrifying blackness, a shadow deeper than any night, a color that felt heavy and suffocating. The professor's face, seen in this near darkness, was a pale mask of shock and ultimate, irreversible confirmation. Eliza tried to cry out, but the sound caught in her throat, a trapped, high-pitched noise. Her own eyes began to register the change. The vivid hues of the brickwork, the oil-slicked gleam of the cobbles, even the color of her own coat, seemed to be losing definition, leaching away into the oppressive, consuming darkness radiating from the small, deadly gilded box. The box had opened its terrible appetite, and it was feeding on the very essence of light and warmth. The transaction was complete, and the cataclysm had begun. The gilded box, now securely in Professor Thresher's possession, continued its silent, insatiable drain, and the nearby instruments were the first to pay the price. They had been laid out to measure the impossible, but were instead violently overwhelmed by it. The chronometer, set up to detect the magnetic field collapse, emitted a high-pitched, grinding shriek. The delicate iron filings embedded within its casing did not simply lose alignment, they were instantly subjected to forces they could not withstand. The brass casing violently cracked, and the clockwork mechanism within seized up, smoking faintly. A fine, silver-gray dust, the literal residue of the disintegrated filings, flew out and settled on the surrounding stones. The magnetic void Thresher had hypothesized was not a gradual event, it was an instantaneous, destructive vacuum. Next was the sextant. Tasked with measuring the deviation of the overhead gaslamp's light, the instrument's sophisticated mirror assembly shuddered and then fractured. The polished glass did not break cleanly. It seemed to shatter inward, consumed by the same light-siphoning force that had attacked Eliza's lantern. The brass arm, meant to rotate, became instantly immobile, frozen by an unknown, localized energy field. It was a clear, terrible indication that the geometry of the alley was now irrevocably warped, twisted by the artifact's proximity. But the most immediate and horrific sign was the survey map of London. Laid flat and rigid on the cobbles, the moment the regulator began to feed, the paper began to blister. A circle of deep scorching appeared around the map's center, the point closest to the gilded box. The charring was not caused by heat, but by an internal, frantic consumption of the paper's very atoms, a chaotic rupture of physical laws. The geographical lines of the city, representing order and scale, vanished beneath a spreading blackness that seemed to crawl. Eliza, now standing in the profound gloom, could hear the terrible sounds of the instruments failing. The shriek, the crack, the subtle hiss of burning paper. Each sound an indisputable confirmation that the artifact was real, active and catastrophic. The professor had acquired knowledge, but at the cost of utter chaos. The tools of science had failed. Now the laws of nature were following suit. The physical world was tearing itself apart around the gilded box, leaving only the sound of its silent, terrible feeding. The failure of the instruments was a violent prelude, the effect on Miss Eliza Pennyworth was a silent, profound devastation. Her physical terror was instantly transcended by a horrifying realization that defied all her scientific training. The Aetheric Regulator was now consuming something essential to her very being. It began with her eyes. The vivid, frightening sight of the lantern light being devoured had been the last true color she perceived. As the profound gloom radiated outwards, Eliza felt a sickening, cold pressure behind her eyeballs. The world did not merely go dark, it became a uniform, crushing gray. She could see forms, the bulk of the professor, the static blackness of the veiled figure, but they were reduced to charcoal sketches, utterly drained of vitality and dimension. The loss of color was not an optical illusion, it was a physical theft. A wave of dizzying disorientation crashed over her. Her hands, still clutching the useless lantern, suddenly felt distant, devoid of the familiar warmth of circulating blood. The cold from the fog was nothing compared to this internal, absorbing chill. It felt as if her own internal light, the residual biological warmth and electrical energy that defined life, was being siphoned away, attracted to the consuming presence of the gilded box. She stumbled backward, trying to break the strange, invisible connection. But the terror was complete, rooted not in a monster or a ghost, but in the precise, terrible execution of an impossible physical law. She had witnessed the undoing of light, the shattering of time, and the incineration of matter. This was not fear. This was the recognition of absolute, unstoppable entropy. Her mouth opened to scream a warning to Professor Thresher, but the sound was thin, pathetic, and immediately consumed by the air. Her knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed onto the wet cobbles, her body no longer generating enough heat to oppose the external cold. In her final moments of terrified consciousness, as the last vestiges of color bled from her sight, she stared wide-eyed at the spot where the gilded box rested. It was a dark shape within a deeper dark, a terrifying hole punched through reality. The horror was not in what she saw, but in the chilling, terrible absence of everything she knew to be real. Her mind, overwhelmed by this ontological violation, retreated, leaving her body a frozen, rapidly cooling husk in the lightless, dying alley. The catastrophic failure of the instruments and the silent collapse of Miss Pennyworth marked the abrupt conclusion of the transaction. The air, thick with the smell of ozone and burnt paper, snapped back into a profound, echoing silence, heavier than before. The gilded box, now possessed by Professor Thresher, was no longer emitting the fierce, light-sucking cold, but a deep, constant hum that was felt more than heard, a sound of immense, contained power. Professor Thresher did not pause to acknowledge the fate of his assistant. His obsession was complete, and his focus was terrifyingly narrow. With the regulator secured in his arms, the professor turned instantly, his silhouette briefly illuminated by the miserable blue ember of Eliza's lantern before he, too, stepped back into the suffocating shadows from which the veiled figure had emerged. He was not walking away. He was retreating into the impossible darkness the artifact had created. The veiled figure followed with its same eerie, gliding movement. Its purpose, whatever it may have been, was fulfilled. It melted back into the alley's gloom, a moving absence that left no disturbed air, no sound, and no trace. The two figures, one a man of obsessive science, the other a terrifying entity, vanished within seconds, swallowed whole by the labyrinthine depths of the foggy passage. The silence that settled on Harrow Alley was definitive. It was the silence of a scene violently vacated, a stage left instantly dark after a terrible, unseen climax. There was no hurried retreat, no scuffle, no final, desperate words. Just the sound of Thresher's heavy footsteps ceasing, followed by the seamless, soundless withdrawal of the figure. The only sound left was the faint, pathetic drip of condensation gathering on the cold brass of the ruined sextant. The objects left behind told the story of a chaotic rupture. The scattered, broken apparatus, the scorched map, and the figure of Eliza Pennyworth, frozen mid-fall. The professor had gone with his prize, leaving the wreckage of his ambition. He had walked away with the very essence of darkness, and the alley, freed of the regulator's active feeding, slowly began to allow the distant, diffused glow of London's gaslight to seep back in, painting the scene in cold, weak shades of grey and shadow. But the truth was that Thresher had not escaped. He had been successfully lured into a terrifying new reality, carrying his doom in a gilded box. The first light of dawn was a cold, weak grey that struggled to penetrate the lingering fumes of the alley. It was Constable Marion who stumbled upon the scene, drawn by the unnatural silence that hung over Harrow Alley, a silence too deep for the waking city. What he found defied the grime and routine of a common London morning. The scattered debris of the scientific instruments immediately signaled an incident of significance. Marion, a career officer accustomed to brawls and petty theft, had never witnessed such precise wreckage. The shattered sextant, the burst chronometer, and the section of map scorched with an impossible, fireless burn. They spoke of a destructive force that was systematic rather than accidental. But it was the figure of the young woman that arrested his attention and curdled the blood in his veins. Marion immediately sent for his superior, and for Dr. Samuel Prentice, the parish physician and a man known for his unflappable temperament. Prentice arrived shortly after, his usual calm demeanor instantly challenged by the sight. Eliza Pennyworth lay on the damp cobbles, yet she was not merely a corpse. She was a monochrome statue. Prentice knelt, his professional training forcing him to ignore the pervasive sense of dread. He noted the meticulous disarray of the instruments, the odd silver dust residue, and the eerie, palpable cold radiating from the girl's body. He recognized the signs of meticulous preparation, the specialized tools, the precise layout, suggesting a scholarly gathering that had somehow been derailed by violent, unearthly forces. The disappearance of Professor Thresher, whose identity was quickly confirmed by papers in the girl's pocket, only deepened the mystery. The physician ran a gloved hand over the skin of the deceased, noting its extraordinary texture, cold to the point of being painful to the touch, and strangely unyielding. He could find no wound, no struggle, and no sign of common poison. Whatever had killed Miss Pennyworth had done so not with force, but with subtraction. It was an impossible death, leaving behind a scene that seemed to defy the very laws of cause and effect the professor had sought to manipulate. Dr. Prentice knew instantly that this was no routine coroner's case. It was a terrifying puzzle, wrapped in the oppressive silence of a Victorian morning. Dr. Samuel Prentice, a man of empirical training, was forced to confront a reality that shredded his understanding of mortality. He stood over the body of Miss Eliza Pennyworth, illuminated by the pale, cold light of the rising sun. She was, as the constables whispered, a portrait of absence. Her skin was the most alarming feature. It possessed a uniform, profound pallor, not the blue-tinged whiteness of asphyxiation or the gray of common shock, but the white of paper that has never seen light. Every hint of biological color, the pink undertones of living flesh, the subtle reds of blood beneath the surface, had been perfectly and utterly erased. Her lips, her nails, even the whites of her eyes, were a single, devastating shade of lightless absence. Prentice touched her coat, then gingerly her exposed wrist. The cold that emanated from her was astonishing. It was not the gradual chill of a body cooling post-mortem. It was a deep, active, absorbing cold, a sensation that seemed to pull the warmth from Prentice's own gloved hand. He registered this fact with a shiver that had nothing to do with the morning air. The body was not merely losing heat, it seemed to be a perfect sink for thermal energy, an object defying the second law of thermodynamics. The final, unsettling detail was the fixed, wide-eyed stare. Her expression was not one of pain, but of ultimate, frozen comprehension. Her eyes, perfectly preserved, seemed to hold the silent, terrible imprint of the final image they had captured, the gilded box, active and consuming. She had died looking at a concept that should not exist. Prentice theorized wildly in his mind. Rigid paralysis? No, there was no sign of muscular strain. Chemical reaction. None known could produce this profound loss of chromatic essence. He concluded, with professional dread, that her death was not caused by a deficit of air or blood, but a deficit of essence itself. Whatever had powered the etheric regulator had used Miss Pennyworth's vital energy, her heat, her biological light, her very color, as fuel, leaving behind a perfectly preserved, terrifying shell. It was a physical contradiction, a horror that the Victorian age of science was utterly unequipped to categorize or even comprehend. The truth was far more terrifying than a simple murder. Dr. Samuel Prentice was a meticulous recorder. Publicly, his official report to the constabulary cited the cause of death for Miss Eliza Pennyworth as pulmonary shock following acute exposure to extreme cold and severe psychological trauma. It was a diagnosis palatable to the bureaucracy, avoiding any mention of the truly impossible. But in the private, leather-bound journal he kept locked in his safe, he committed the horrifying truth to paper. His entry, written later that morning under the shaky light of his study lamp, detailed the findings the medical community would never accept. He referred to the profound loss of color and heat with clinical precision, yet with underlying terror. Observation 1. The corporeal pallor is total. Not simply the absence of blood circulation, but the literal absence of pigment in the epidermal layer. It is the visual record of an ultimate subtraction. The color has been extracted, not merely faded. I can only surmise that the chromatic energy itself was consumed. Prentice then revisited the chilling thermal anomaly. He had used a laboratory-grade thermometer to test the body's temperature, a reading that defied all post-mortem calculations. Observation 2. The body retains an active cold. The temperature is impossibly low, a level that would require exposure to Arctic extremes for many hours, which is entirely inconsistent with the timeline. Furthermore, the corpse is acting as a thermal sponge, drawing heat from the surrounding air and my hand. It is not merely cold, it is an active cold sink. The professor's regulator must draw not only light but also kinetic energy, heat, from surrounding life to maintain its own terrible potential. He recognized his duty was to public health and order. Releasing this information would provoke panic, ridicule, or accusations of madness. He had a brief, terrifying thought that Professor Thresher had not escaped but had merely been successfully converted into a conduit for the artifact's power, disappearing only after he had fully activated it. Prentice carefully sealed the journal, condemning the truth of Eliza Pennyworth's death to the status of a private, harrowing secret. He knew the alley held the key to a truth that transcended murder, a truth that proved the existence of forces that could systematically unmake a person. The official record was a lie, a necessary fiction to shield London from the horror that had been briefly unleashed in Harrow Alley.